Hi everyone. I'm doing a book review today. I should be revising, but meh, it's fine. I'm sure I'll get over it. Um, Without further ado, today I'm going to do a book review, and the book is Popular Magic: Cunning Folk in English History by Owen Davies. And Owen Davies is a lecturer in history at the University at Hertfordshire, and the author of A People Bewitched. And what's interesting about this book, and I'm going to say this before anything, is if you want to get into more traditional forms of witchcraft, I have a lot of people here saying, oh, how can I get into sort of traditional based practices of witchcraft or more folkloric aspects of witchcraft? I would say read academic books, actually read books that are academic, because then you can actually take things what people done, and that's an example of old witchcraft, and you can work and use those charms in your own spells, or, if you want to put a little bit of a swing on it, you can. And it's interesting to actually obviously read the history. If you're interested in modern traditional witchcraft, then you should be interested in the historic aspect of witchcraft. And this book is so interesting, really, really interesting. I'll explain some of the chapters. But you've got cunning folk and the law, for good or evil, who and why, services, books, written charms, European comparisons, and cunning folk in the 20th century. And you get your notes and bibliography index. What I like about this book is it's very factual. This book doesn't particularly cut corners. It kind of just, says history as it is. And it's great to actually know how cunning folk operated from a historical, it's great to know how they actually practice, and it's interesting. And the law on cunning folk, I mean, in this book it states a lot how the law, when it comes to cunning folk, more than most, cunning folk they were in trouble with the law a couple of times, but it would have been clients that would have actually prosecuted them if spells or charms they'd done actually didn't work. And what I actually like about this book is it actually talks about sort of fraudsters and people that there were a lot of people in history that claimed to be cunning folk but were actually charlatans and fraudulents. And it's interesting to actually read the cases of that, and in some cases quite funny because you're like, oh god. But yeah, it's a really, really interesting book. Another interesting thing I learned from this book is that there's the comparison between charmers and cunning folk and witches. And basically charmers were the ones that charmed away warts, the one that charmed, they charmed away various things. So it would be like warts, sort of minor things. Whereas a cunning folk could be more interested in unbewitching somebody. That was the main thing. And interestingly enough, finding treasure, which I was like, oh, kind of, I didn't know, but I actually forgot. But I actually didn't realize how much people sort of consulted cunning folk in order to find treasure. And I thought that was quite interesting. Another thing that's really interesting is that, you'll get all sort of modern day sort of pagans that'll be like, oh, they're Christians, done this, done that. And well, actually, there were a lot of priests and vicars at it. There were, in this book, there are a lot of people of clergy that actually were cunning folk. And the cunning folk, went to church with their clients and stuff like that. So yeah, I think there's a case. I think there's a case of a clergyman in here that actually conjured a circle and consulted spirits for finding treasure. It was he was actually punished as well. But it's interesting. Cunning folk and the law, in terms of the law, like wise women were more at stake and were more in trouble with the law than male cunning folk. However, that's not to say that male cunning folk were. Yeah, there's just loads of stuff. It's really interesting. What's interesting as well is I actually live in Manchester, but I live in Salford, Salford Keys, which is quite pretty compared to normal Salford. But basically in here, when I was reading this book about a week ago, me and my friend was passing a pub called the White Horse. It was like the White Horse Inn, and I don't even know why we said that, because a lot of pubs are called the White Horse Inn, but it turns out the White Horse Inn actually belonged to a cunning man named Richard Morris. It's not just that as well. There's loads of interesting stuff that sort of caters all throughout England. And it's really, really interesting. In terms of the books and stuff like that, it actually reiterated to me just how powerful back then the ability to actually write, the ability to actually read and write was. And a lot of cunning folk were consulted purely because on the basis that they had loads of books. Some cunning folk couldn't actually read, but would hand copy out charms from books for their clients, or they would have some books that were mainly grimoires. So like the discovery of witchcraft was actually made by an author. I think it's Reginald Scott. I think I'm not sure. But to basically sort of show the silly superstition of witchcraft, and in actually doing so, the author actually aided a lot of cunning folk, and a lot of people that practiced would have been labelled by some people as white witches in certain areas, and it was mainly Cornwall and Devon area. But those texts actually helped folk magical practitioners. So I might actually, from reading this book, buy The Discovery of Witchcraft. Not just that, there are loads of different grimoires: the Red Dragon, the Black Hen or the Black Pullet, Le Noir Pullet, which is the black chicken, Black Hen, Poulet even. Sorry, this is embarrassing. I used to live in France and I used to speak French. It's gone since I went to England, come back to England. Anyway. Loads of different grimoires, but you realise just how important the written word really was way back when. Like, you really just realise how important the written word actually was, and that people saw power in the ability to write. It then went on to the written charms and books, but there's loads of stuff in this book. Anybody who is interested in the historical perspective of witchcraft should buy this book. And I think it's important, if you're going to identify as someone who is a traditional witch, it's important to actually read history. And I think this book I highly recommend. And it's interesting to see the sort of main things of cunning folk. Some of the main roles were unbewitching, number one priority, finding treasure, and thieves, identifying thieves. And it was interesting to see some of the methods in which they used to identify the thief. And a lot of the times there would have been people that were just wrongly convicted, because the cunning folk, there were some cunning folk that were charlatans. Or would get the client to actually scry in the mirror themselves and see the image of the person themselves, so the cunning folk wouldn't actively be blaming somebody. So yeah, it's just really, really interesting. Buy this book; it's awesome. I highly recommend this book. It also then goes on to speak about cunning folk in the 20th century. And basically, are there any cunning folk that are left? And I much rather enjoyed the end of the chapter, because it sort of gave a job description for a cunning folk at the end, and I loved it. But it's interesting because Owen Davis basically says, when people will start being bewitched, then maybe cunning folk may come back. But all of the clients that I have had, and I've had quite a few now, No, I've had more than a few, but I've had quite a lot of clients. The main thing is unbewitching. That's the main thing that I've done for people. Unbewitching as well as house cleansings and stuff like that, but it mainly points down to unbewitching. So it was interesting to see, you know, because most of my work that I do for clients is unbewitching based stuff. Whenever I get a love spell, I get slightly excited. I'm like, oh, something different. But yes, popular magic, cunning folk, and English history. It's fantastic. It really is. I really, really enjoyed this book. The thing is, there is a lot of books, you know, coming from the point and perspective of academia that can be really, really lengthy in words. It's not really like that. It's actually, you know, sometimes I feel that the way people can write things and sort of say things in academic books, the words can be rather lengthy for some people to understand. This book wasn't like that. The words weren't too elaborated. It was actually nice to see because I can read lengthy books, but sometimes it can get to the point where it's rather a little bit like deciphering than actually reading. So yes, this book isn't too deciphery, but I highly recommend anybody to buy this book because it really is a fantastic book. I got this book from Amazon as well for my birthday from my other half. Yeah, it's changed my perspective on a lot of historical aspects of popular magic or folk magic, and it's just interesting to see because it's nice to actually see a book that references stuff. So this is the information I'm giving because in blah 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 this happened to this person named rah 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 in this court of, and it's refreshing. It's great to see that. So yes, popular magic, cunning folk in English history, Owen Davis, awesome book, highly recommended.